characters were the first place that Chris Huntley and I started, way back, oh God, 22 years ago or so, when we were at USC and we were first thinking about trying to figure out how stories worked, the beginnings of the Dramatica theory. And what we did is, we said, let's put down some things we know about story, that everybody knows about story, the common knowledge, and see if there's anything we can interpolate from this. So we said, what have we got? We've got a protagonist. Everybody knows the protagonist. And we decided to use this character instead of the hero because protagonist smacked of a particular job to do. The one who was out there trying to make it happen, as opposed to a hero who was just somebody you identified with who was heroic, you know. And right then and there we felt we want to be a little more definitive. So let's use the word protagonist. Let's have the relationship we can have between a protagonist and an antagonist. And that's where we started. Antagonist, okay? Now everybody knows this part, pretty much. And then we began to think, well, who else have we got in stories? Who else do you see? Well, very often you have a character who's like the scientist or the one who always has a plan, the thinker. And we decided to call that the reason character. R-E-A-S-O-N, reason. And it stood to reason that if we had a reason character, the counterpart would be emotion. We thought it was feeling for a while, but then we realized that feeling was kind of the process, just like logic is the process of this character, feeling is the process of this character, and reason is the outcome or product of logic, just as emotion is the product of feeling. So now we had these two characters, and the emotion character was often represented as a screamer in the genres we were looking at. We were interested in horror films and science fiction and fantasy and things like that. So we saw these four characters and we said, well, that's a nice balance, but are there any more? Well, we looked at some of our favorite stories, we looked around a little bit, and we found that indeed there were some more characters. Some of the characters we had with a sidekick. We'd always see this sidekick. And you can tell a sidekick because there's an interesting storytelling thing. They almost have a T and an O at the end. You've got Tonto, Toto, Kato. I mean, everybody seems to name their sidekicks with a T-O at the end. There's something about it, I don't know why. But a sidekick was the faithful supporter, the one who stood by through thick and thin no matter what. And we said, okay, sidekick. And at first we thought the sidekick was just faithful to the protagonist. You see, in those days we didn't realize objective characters were described by their function, and they just represented that particular attribute, and they used it everywhere with everybody. So a sidekick can be like Renfield to Dracula, you know, a sidekick just as a faithful supporter, and he's faithfully supportive by nature. That's his nature. So you look at the character's nature, not necessarily who they're related to, but what they do. Protagonist tries to achieve it, antagonist tries to prevent it. The reason character uses logic, the emotion character uses feelings. The sidekick's a faithful supporter. Is there a balance? Were stories actually symmetrical? Was there any symmetry to them? We didn't know, but we thought, what's the opposite of a sidekick? Well, unlike reason and emotion, the name didn't suggest anything, but if we looked at this character as a faithful supporter, then we could look at a character who was kind of a disbelieving opposer, as it were, and we said, what is this character that we see? And we called them a skeptic. A skeptic. And you see skeptics in stories all the time saying, no, I don't think we ought to do it, or no, I think we better turn back, or this plan will never work, or whatever it is, I'm against it. That's the skeptic. So we saw these as kind of archetypal characters that showed up all over the place. And we said, are there any more? Well, for a while we didn't think there were any more, and then we realized that there was a character who was kind of a teacher, a helper. We called him the guardian. Now, why didn't we know this from Joseph Campbell? Why didn't we know this from Jung, that we have a character who's a teacher, a helper, a guardian? Because when we started Dramatica, we decided that we didn't want to pollute ourselves with common knowledge. It's a strange concept, but we felt that if we put blinders on and intentionally did not read anything anybody had ever done before, we might reinvent the wheel and waste our time, but we also might just stumble across something that everybody else knew better than to look at, because if we didn't have any preconceptions, we could cover perhaps some new ground. So this, to us, the Guardian, was an amazing revelation. Oh, there's a Guardian, and we thought that was it. But it really bothered us, because we had protagonist, antagonist, reason, emotion, sidekick, skeptic, guardian, and okay, we had nothing here. What is that space? Could it be that stories were not symmetrical? Well, for a while we thought maybe there were, but then we realized you know, there's this other character who kind of screws things up. This one kind of helps along, this one kind of screws things up. In fact, this guardian is almost like a good conscience, and this is kind of like a tempter. Well, of course, Campbell and Jung and all those guys had talked about the tempter and the trickster and everything. We didn't know all that. We just knew that this character was kind of the one who was messing things up negatively. So we called them, coined a word, Chris actually coined this, the contagonist. Now why don't we just call them something else like a trickster or a tempter or something, because they do more than trick and they do more than tempt. They do different things. And early on in Dramatica we discovered that if we used a well-known word for something, people would assume that we meant the well-known definition, the well-known meaning. If we meant something else, it was a lot harder to take an existing word and say, forget everything you've ever known about this word, redefine it this way. It was a lot harder to do that than it was to come up with a brand new word and just say, this word means such and such. And then we could be more precise and people wouldn't have preconceptions that we have to overcome about what the word meant. So, even though we, quite by accident, came up with a contagonist not knowing other words existed, we decided to keep it for those reasons. So we have protagonist, antagonist, reason, emotion, sidekick, skeptic, guardian, and contagonist. That made a complete set of our archetypes. And to this day, those archetypes have held in Dramatica.